I want to finish this book up and rate it with you all so we can move on out of this book. It's been a great, emotional, joyful journey, as every book should be, and I want to share it with you. Page 248. She'd been such a jerk, just like 4 years ago. The parallel between the way she'd behaved on the two occasions was mortifying. How could she ever face him again? Page 255. Hey, Farley, come and join us. Oblivious to the emotional undercurrents flowing between Cassidy and Farley, Straws made room for Farley to sit next to him. I was just about to ask Cassidy here how their horses were making out. I heard that you had some strangles to contend with. Cassie noticed how tired Farley looked, and she hated that it was all her fault. She wrapped her hands around her mug of coffee, then turned to Straws. Quarantine was just lifted today. 2 of our horses recovered, but, she steeled herself to say the rest, we did lose one of our older horses. I'm sorry to hear that. I hope it wasn't that beautiful Palomino who died. No, you've seen Lucky Lucy? He nodded. I thought your mother was being a little foolhardily when she took her to Joe Party's ranch on the other side of Lewistown. Sure, Joe knows what he's doing when it comes to training barrel horses, but Purdy's has been battling the infection for over a year, never properly isolated and contained the disease when he first showed up, and now it's spread pretty much through the entire herd. Cassidy could see that Farley was as shocked to hear this news as she was. Page 256. I hadn't heard about that, Farley said slowly. Purdy's ranch is out of my district. When did Mom take Lucy to Joe Purdy's ranch? Straws wrinkled his brow. Must have been about mid-April. 2 weeks before Cassidy had come home from college. Maybe she didn't know about the strangles. Straws shook his head. I warned her myself. A snippet of the conversation came back to her then. Farley remembered when you asked if any of our horses had left the property recently. He nodded, but didn't say anything. She knew he was recalling how Jackson had mentioned seeing Olive and loaded Lucky Lucy into the trailer, and she insisted he was mistaken, but this seemed to imply that Jackson had been telling the truth. It was her mother who had lied, but why? Anyway, I'm glad it all worked out in the end. Straws finished his coffee. I should hit the road. Cass, do you think about my offer, you hear? He winked. I pay real good in case you haven't heard. Other than the older rancher was gone. Farley lifted his brows. Straws tried to hire you? He's looking for a new riding teacher. Someone who knows how to barrel race, but who cared about much such details now. Farley, can you believe Mom would have exposed Lucy to strangles on purpose? It doesn't make sense. Everyone around here knows that Straws has the best trainers in the area, and his operation is impeccable. If she wanted extra training for Lucy, why not take her to the Monahans? It doesn't make sense, he agreed. Unless you don't think she did it on purpose because of me. I hate to sound paranoid, but she might have figured that if a couple of our horses came down with strangles, I'd be home in a few weeks, and I'd be an obvious person to look after them. That's twisted, but there is a certain logic to it, Farley said. Plus, Cassidy thought not only had the strangles kept her on the ranch, it had forced her into spending time with Dan Farley, the main Olive thought she should marry. The man Olive thought she should marry. I'll get it right in a minute. But that part was just too embarrassing to say out loud. This is crazy, isn't it? Mom can be manipulative, but she never had to go this far. She's good at a business person to risk spreading strangles all over to her entire herd. 255, 256, 257, 258, and 259. Farley was quiet for a while. Then in a low voice he said, maybe she took a calculated risk. She knew riding the horses were separating them from the breeding ones, and the chances of the quarter horses getting infected were slim. Plus, she probably knows that only 10% of the horses would develop strangles, would ever develop complications. Maybe she hoped your horses would ride it out without any lasting problems. Or maybe she calculated all this and concluded that the loss of a horse would be worth it, Cassidy concluded bitterly. Farley rubbed his forehead, then sighed. You know what? I think the drama of the past few days is catching up to us. There's much more likely scenario. Really, I'd like to hear it. Your mother probably had her own reasons, and for wanting Purdy to work with her horse, she chose to ignore the possibility of getting strangles, figuring the chances were small. Then when the infection did show up, she was embarrassed to own up to her own mistake. His scenario seemed more likely. Cassidy had to agree. But it still put the responsibility for the outbreak all on her mother. And it didn't change the fact that she lied. Farley left the cafe with Cassidy. Running into her this way had not been helpful to either the headache pounding behind his eyes or to his spirits, which they all felt as if they'd been dragged behind a herd of wild horses for a few days. He'd been up early, wanting to arrange Finnegan's burial as soon as possible. He also wanted to disinfect the barn so Cassidy wouldn't have to face the heartbreak of doing it herself. It had seemed like the gentlemanly thing to do. Out in the sunshine, standing behind the old truck she was so ridiculously fond of, she thanked him. Page 260 and 261. I slept in until noon. I can't remember the last time I did that, and when I finally made it down to the home barn, you'd taken care of everything. Thank you, Farley. He had to look away, unable to bear how pretty she looked with the sunshine glittering in her golden hair. She run out on him twice. Now only a fool would risk that kind of humiliation a third time. Don't worry about it. It's part of the job when you're a vet. He saw that his comment wounded her, but hell, what did she expect from him? Look, I'm sorry about running out last night. You must have thought I was crazy. You had a rough night, and for the record, I wasn't trying to take advantage of that. Of course you weren't. Good, I'm glad that's clear. His anger was coming through in his voice. He didn't intend it to, but couldn't seem to stop it either. It is, she said softly. Well, I better get going. I have a busy day. She nodded. He hesitated. Hope you get that job, Cass. To hell with what your family thinks. You have to go after what you want in life. Last night he'd been crazy enough to think that what he wanted was her. But he needed a woman with a little more staying power. 260 and 261. Moving forward to 262, 263, 264, 265. Once the initial shock of discovering that her mother had purposely exposed their horse to strangles had passed, Cassidy had started to wonder about why her mother would want Lucy trained in the barrel racing in the first place. Once again, and the puzzle pieces came together too easily. Probably Olive hoped that barrel racing was another lure that she could use to reel her daughter back in Coffee Creek. A beautiful horse like Lucy, practically ideal for barrel racing. What horse-loving woman could resist? Really, Olive had played all her cards, not leaving anything to chance. She wouldn't be pleased to find out she had lost this anyway. Around 5 o'clock, Cassidy groomed Lucy and let her out with the other horses. Then she cleaned the arena, and she and Sky had to sit down and wait. At 5:45, the posse of riders was visible coming down the south-north. Cassidy watched until the moving blob turned into individual riders, then identifiable faces. When they finally came to the barn, she could tell that they all were exhausted. Still, she showed no mercy. Finnegan died. Everyone was silent for a moment. Then Corb shook his head. I'm sorry to hear that. When did it happen? Last night. Farley's already had him buried. The barn's been disinfected and our quarantine is lifted. Finn was a good horse, but he was old, Olive said. I know you did everything you could for him. At least this ordeal is behind us now. And who should we thank for that, Mother? Olive swung out of her saddle and handed the reins to Dave, who come up to help with the horses, and Dave led the tired horse into the barn for grooming. The two other wranglers, Eric and Jay, followed. That left Corb, Jackson, Olive, her brother, and her mother were gaping at her with surprise. Jackson just looked as though he wanted to escape. When he tried to leave with the other cowboys, Cassidy stopped him by grabbing his arm. Please stay a minute. I'd like to get your input on something. Sure, he said cautiously. I'm sorry about your horse. I know how much you love Finnegan. Thanks, Jackson. She blinked away her tears. This wasn't the time to be soft. Speaking slowly and carefully, not to raise her voice, Cassidy recounted the information Straws had passed on to her at the Cinnamon Stick Cafe. Is it true, Mom? Did you know Joe Purdy had strangles on his ranch when you took Lucy over to him for training? Olive's face had growing progressively paler. Her eyes darted from her daughter's face to her son's, then finally to Jackson's. Undoubtedly, she was remembering earlier assertion that he'd seen her loading Lucy into a trailer. She'd managed to discredit him the first time he said it, but this time it wouldn't be so easy. Almost after a minute of silence, she drew a breath. You're right, I took a risk that I shouldn't have. It's supposed to be a surprise for you, Cassidy. I originally bought Lucy to give to you as a graduation gift. Remembering how much you love barrel racing, I thought that it would be fun to get a little upfront training. Despite her resolve to be firm and unyielding, Cassidy felt a little piece of her heart soften at this. Her mom had been right about one thing. She loved Lucy and couldn't have selected a more perfect horse for herself. But why risk her getting strangles? You could have taken her to Straws if getting some training was so important to you. I wanted it to be a secret, and I was worried someone in Monaghan's would blab. You know how news travels fast in Coffee Creek. The first part of her mother's explanation had tweaked her heartstrings. But this, it just didn't make sense. Again, the risk for a smart business person like her mother just wouldn't have been worth it, unless it had been a calculated risk. You knew that a young, healthy horse like Lucy would almost certainly recover completely from the bout of strangles, didn't you? Cassidy, are you suggesting that I wanted Lucy to get sick? Corb looked shocked as Olive sounded, but Jackson, Cassidy noticed, didn't seem surprised at all by the suggestion. She met her mother's gaze, and in that instant she knew that she had to stop right here. Spelling out the reasons why her mother might have done such a thing would not give her any satisfaction, and undoubtedly create wounds that would take a long time to heal. Only you know the answer to that question, Mom. Then she asked Jackson if they could talk for a few minutes. That was page 261, 262, 263, 64, and 65 and 6. Moving forward to 270, which is a short paragraph. Are you sure, Mom? 'Cause I don't mind. I'm sure, she snapped. Then she shook her head. What's gotten into you, daughter? There were a lot of answers to that question. Some Olive would have found quite unkind. So Cassidy stuck with the obvious. I've just grown up. That's all. Moving on. Okay. 287 and 288. She wondered about her family, her dog, and her horse. Mostly she wondered about Farley. Would he miss her at all? Anger drove Farley for several days after Cassidy left Coffee Creek. That damn woman had toyed with him again like he was a mouse. Again, and he let her. What the hell was wrong with him? By Thursday, that story wasn't washing anymore. After dinner, when he was walking out with his dogs, he finally admitted the truth. Cassidy wasn't manipulating or playing games. If she slept with him, it had to have meant something to her. Trouble was, the meaning had been inconvenient. It hadn't fit into her plan. And so she ran. And what had he done? Taken offense and pulled back. Never once had he told her how he really felt about her. Never once had he put his heart or his pride on the line and said the words. Once he told her that if she wanted something, she should go after it. Page 288. Didn't the same advice apply to him? Farley went into the office to check his appointments for the next day. As usual, his schedule was booked solid. He could always wait for Saturday, but his gut told him no. It had to be tomorrow. He slashed a black line through his afternoon appointments. Liz would make the phone calls for him. After lunch, he'd be on the road. Page 290 and 291, and guess what's next? The rating. Cassidy looked. Adrian had spotted one of the hot cowboys all right. He was tall, dark, and broad-shouldered, dressed entirely in black, leaning against a concrete pillar, one cowboy boot crossed casually over the other. As soon as her gaze landed on him, he touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. My, oh my. Adrian patted a hand over her sleek brown hair. He's looking right at me. I just know as if he knows me or something. He's hot, all right, Cassidy agreed, but he's mine. She reached down and took off her high-heeled shoes that had started to blister on the back of her heel. In her bare feet, she walked the hot concrete path, dropped the shoes into the handy trash can. Good riddance to you. Way to go, sister, cheered a woman wearing white running shoes with her suit. Cassidy smiled, but kept walking in a line that would take her straight to Farley. He was the last person she expected to see here, but she now realized he was the only one she really wanted. With every step she drew closer to him, and he was smiling. Momentarily she felt a pang of sorrow for all she was leaving behind. She had so many hopes and aspirations. But she saw now that it never had been something she wanted, only something her mother didn't want her to want. She spent the past 5 years in pretty confused state between trying to think for herself and avoid her mother's attempts at manipulation. She got forgotten to do most of the important thing. Follow her heart. When she reached him, Farley held out his arms and swept her feet right off the ground. I missed you, he said, and I've come to get you, but only if you're ready to be mine and no more running. She looked into his eyes. So steadfast, so true. There was something powerful between them, and it had been there from the start. At 21 it had scared her, but now she understood that far from being subsumed by it, she would be made stronger by it, and more fulfilled. I love you, Farley. And then he kissed her. I'm not going to read the epilogue to this story. I want you to read it. I'm going to rate it 22. It pulled at my heartstrings. It's a must read. And with that, thank you for tuning in. Thank you for watching. It's been one of those most emotional, heartbreaking stories, but at the same time, the most heartfelt stories. And I love books like that. Thank you for the adventure. Stay tuned. I'm sure in the future I'll have another book review. I've got to find a book that holds my interest, I don't get bored with, and I can read it straight through. I have tried and tried to start a lot of books lately, but for some reason they just don't have that grab you at the heart feeling. I have tried this new one. It's hard for me to get into reading it, but we will see if it does in the days to come. Again, thank you. God bless.